So we're going to resume the United Nations Security Council report on the fall of Srebrenica at page 80, section E, 14th of July, mass executions commence. European Union negotiator meets Milosevic and Mladic. If you want to watch the last part, it's on my channel. I'll link it in the description of the video. Section E, 14th of July, mass executions commence. European Union negotiator meets Milosevic and Mladic. Section 361. It has since been learned that the Bosnian Serbs began the systematic extermination of the thousands of Bosniak males being held in Bratunac in the early morning hours of the 14th of July. At that time, they began loading the Bosniaks into vehicles and transporting them to different locations in the wider area. Those locations turned out to be extermination sites, where there is strong evidence to suggest that all of those men were executed over the next 2 to 3 days, with the exception of a handful of individuals who survived by hiding under or among the dead bodies. 5 of those locations, and the dates when the executions are believed to have taken place were Orahovac, in brackets Lazete, on the 14th of July, the quote dam near Petkovici on the 14th and 15th of July, the Brandjevo farm on the 16th of July, the Pilica Cultural Centre on or about the 16th of July, and Kozluk on or around about the 17th or 16th of July. Section 362. One of the members of a unit participating in the execution, Dražen Edemović, a Bosnian Croat who had enlisted in the BSA, surrendered himself to the tribunal and, in 1996, provided it with a detailed testimony of killings he had himself participated in or was aware of at 2 of the execution sites, Branjevo Farm and the Pilica Cultural Centre. Edemović belonged to the, quote, 10th Sabotage Unit, based at Han Plisac, the headquarters of the BSA. He recounted how the members of his unit were ordered on the 16th of July to go to a farm, Branjevo Farm, in the area of Pilica, though they were not initially told for what purpose. He then recounted how buses carrying Bosniak men began arriving at the farm, one by one, and how one of his commanding officers then ordered him and his unit to, quote, execute those people, to shoot them. He remembered about between 15 and 20 buses in total arriving, carrying men between the ages of 17 and 70. The men on the first bus were blindfolded and their hands were tied. The rest were neither blindfolded nor were their hands tied. Section 363. Another group of soldiers reportedly from the Bratunac Brigade joined Adamovic's unit as the buses were arriving. These soldiers proceeded to beat the civilians with bars. They forced them to kneel and to pray in the Muslim manner, to bow their heads, Adamovic continued. He concluded that they were attempting to humiliate these men before they were to be killed. Adamovic emphasized that he attempted to extricate himself from the killings that were about to take place because, he stated, quote, I was sorry for those people simply. I had no reason to shoot those people. They had done nothing to me, unquote. He indicated that he was nevertheless proceeding with the killings, facing the option of his own death. Even the bus drivers, he pointed out, were ordered to kill at least one man each, quote, so that they could not testify. Adamovic believed that members of the 10th Sabotage Unit and elements from what he presumed to be the Bratunac Brigade, including himself, proceeded to line up between 1,000 and 1,200 men that day on the farm near Pilica and systematically kill them. When asked how many people he killed himself, Adamovic responded, I would rather not know how many people I killed. The killings were not over, however. Section 364. Adamovic recalled how, after the executions had been carried out on the Branjevo farm, one of his commanding officers said that there was still another group of about 500 Bosniak men still being held at the cultural centre in Pilica. This time Adamovic managed to extricate himself from the killing, which appears to have been carried out by small arms fire and hand grenades thrown into the hall. Section 365. Adamovic told the tribunal, quote, I wanted to testify because of my conscience, because of all that happened, because I did not want that. I was simply compelled to, forced to, and I could choose between my life or the life of those people. and I had lost my life then, and had I lost my life then, that would not have changed the fate of those people. The fate of those people was decided by somebody holding a much higher position than I did. As I have said already, what really got me, it has completely destroyed my life, and that this is why I testified. It is worth bearing in mind that Erdamovic, a Bosnian Croat, remains the only individual who participated in the executions from the 14th to the 17th of July who has surrendered himself. The tribunal has reconstructed the crime scene from that period on the basis of the forensic evidence, which it has used to corroborate the stories of the handful of men who survived the execution. 366. The accounts of the survivors of the other execution sites are equally horrific. The horror of those being held in Bratunac had begun a few days earlier, on the 14th of July, when one group of men was loaded into buses and taken to a school near the Lazete hamlet, where they were then jammed into a warehouse. Throughout the morning, the warehouse continued to be filled with men, until they were eventually taken out, given some water and told that they were to be exchanged. They were then put into trucks, which took them 800 metres north of the school, taken off of the trucks, lined up in a field, and shot. Section 367. Also on the 14th of July, another group was taken from Bratunac past Zvornik to Karakaj and the aluminium factory, and were dropped off at the Petkovitsky school. They were jammed into the school's gymnasium and classrooms. During the course of the day, they were subjected to lethal beatings. In the afternoon and evening, people were placed in trucks and taken to the plateau of the dam of the aluminium factory, the Red Dam, and executed. Some of their bodies are believed to have been thrown into the lake, others piled into mass graves. Section 368. On or about the 15th of July, a group of approximately 450 people were taken from Bratunac to Kozluk, located on the Drina, which is a river, north of Karakaj. They were all summarily executed, only a few hundred metres from the barracks of the, quote, Drina Wolves, which were a unit of Serbian militiamen. Section 369. On the 16th of July, a column of Bosniak men that had set out from Srebrenica to Šušařari, I believe that's pronounced, was still trying to make its way to ARBIH-held territory. Many of these men surrendered and apparently loaded onto buses and trucks and taken to the Srpska Valley. One Srebrenica survivor later recalled, realizing that he was walking on blood as he arrived there, and that 1 week later others passing through the Srpska Valley could smell corpses. 150 bodies, with their hands bound, were subsequently found at the mass grave near this location. Section 370. Over the past 4 years, the tribunal has been able to determine that those killed between the 14th and 17th of July were buried within 24 to 48 hours in mass graves in close proximity to the execution sites. See the map at the end of this chapter. I'll put an image in the video at some point. In some cases, the victims were made to dig their own graves. In others, they were shot while standing in them. It appears that, over the course of the next several months, the bodies were taken out of the initial mass graves and reburied in 33 different, quote, secondary sites. Each of these secondary sites is believed to contain the remains of between 80 and 180 bodies. The tribunal has managed to probe each of those sites and has fully exhumed 7 of them. To date, the tribunal has found the remains of approximately 2,000 victims from those sites which have been fully exhumed, of which the identities of roughly 30 have been determined thus far. 14th of July, meeting with Milosevic and Mladic. Section 371. The international community does not appear to have had any evidence at the time that executions were taking place in such staggering numbers. In fact, almost all the individuals interviewed in the context of this report indicated that they simply did not expect or even imagine the possibility of such barbarity. However, the Dutch Bat debriefing report reveals that 2 Dutch Bat soldiers, on their way back from Nova Kasaba to Bratunac on the 14th of July, had seen between 500 and 700 corpses on the roadside. However, the same report indicated that 2 other members of the Dutch Bat travelling in the same vehicle saw only a few corpses. No written record has been located indicating that Dutchbat made either account available to the UN Pro-4 chain of command on the 14th of July, or in the days immediately thereafter. Thus, it is not clear how many bodies were there at the time, and if they were those of soldiers who had been in the quote column and had been killed in battle with the BSA, or those of defenceless individuals who had been summarily executed. Section 372. On the 14th of July, the European Union negotiator, Mr. Blid, travelled to Belgrade to meet with President Milosevic. The meeting took place in Dobanovici, the hunting lodge outside of Belgrade, where Mr. Blid had met President Milosevic and General Mladic 1 week earlier. According to Mr. Blid's public account of that second meeting, he pressed the President to arrange immediate access for UNHCR to assist the people of Srebrenica, and for ICRC to start to register those who were being treated by the BSA as prisoners of war. He also insisted that the Netherlands soldiers be allowed to leave at will. Mr. Blid added that the international community would not tolerate an attack on Gorazde, and that a quote green light would have to be secured for free and unimpeded access to the enclaves. He also demanded that the road between Kiseljak and Sarajevo, Route Swan, unquote, be opened to all non-military transport. President Milosevic apparently acceded to the various demands, but also claimed that he did not have control over the matter. Milosevic had also apparently explained, earlier in the meeting, that the whole incident had been provoked by escalating Muslim attacks from the enclave in violation of the 1993 demilitarization agreement. Nasser Oric and people like that. Section 373. A few hours into the meeting, General Mladic arrived at Dobanovici. Mr. Blid noted that General Mladic readily agreed to most of the demands on Srebrenica, but remained opposed to some of the arrangements pertaining to the other enclaves, Sarajevo in particular. Eventually, with President Milosevic's intervention, it appeared that an agreement in principle had been reached. It was decided that another meeting would be held the next day in order to confirm the agreements. Mr. Blid had already arranged with Mr. Stoltenberg and Mr. Akashi that they would join him in Belgrade. He also requested that the UN Pro-4 commander also come to Belgrade in order to finalise some of the military details with Mladic. Section 374. Meanwhile, the Security Council had again convened to discuss the situation in Srebrenica and had adopted a presidential statement, in which it recalled its Resolution 1004 from 1995 and expressed deep concern about the ongoing forced relocation of tens of thousands of civilians from the Srebrenica safe area to the Tuzla region by the Bosnian Serbs. The Council considered this forced relocation to be a clear violation of the human rights of the civilian population. The Council was, quote, especially concerned about reports that up to 4,000 men and boys had been forcibly removed by the Bosnian Serb party from the Srebrenica safe area. It demanded that, quote, in conformity with internationally recognized standards of conduct and international law, that the Bosnian Serb party release them immediately, respect fully the rights of the civilian population of the Srebrenica safe area, and other persons protected under international humanitarian law, and permit access by the International Committee of the Red Cross, unquote. Section F. 15th of July. Massacres continue. Agreement between Mladic and United Nations Protection Force. Section 375. The co-chairman of the International Conference on the former Yugoslavia, the special representative of the Secretary-General, and the UN Pro-4 commander convened for a meeting at the United States Embassy in Belgrade on the morning of the 15th of July. Mr. Blid briefed the gathering on the results of his meeting with Milosevic and Mladic the previous day. Aware of reports that grave human rights abuses might have been committed against the men and boys of Srebrenica, but unaware that mass and systematic executions had commenced, the gathering of senior international officials then joined Milosevic and Mladic for a largely ceremonial meeting over lunch. This was followed by a meeting between the UN Pro-4 commander and Mladic to finalise the details. Section 376. In his account of those meetings, Mr. Blid explains that the participants decided not to initially reveal publicly that the meeting had been held, or to divulge the substance of any agreements reached. He explains that this decision was taken because the meeting with Mladic was ostensibly taking place without Karadzic's knowledge, and that they did not want the latter to find out. Mr. Blid indicates that it had become part of a concerted effort to use Mladic in order to undermine Karadzic. Mr. Blid adds that it was nevertheless decided that the provisions of the agreement relating to Srebrenica would take effect immediately, even if not officially signed, whereas the provisions relating to Gorazde, Zepa, and Sarajevo and other matters would be finalized after another meeting between Mladic and the UN Profor commander, to be held in Serb-held territory outside of Sarajevo at 1200 hours on the 19th of July. The second meeting would not be kept secret, and after its conclusion, all points agreed upon, including on Srebrenica, would then be revealed. Section 377. The points of agreement reached on Srebrenica, as reported to the United Nations headquarters at the time, were following: full access to the area for UNHCR and ICRC to have immediate access to, quote, prisoners of war, to assess their welfare, register them, and review procedures at Bosnian Serb reception centres in accordance with the Geneva Convention. UN Profor requests to resupply of Srebrenica via Belgrade, Ljubovija, and Bratunac to be submitted on the 17th of July. Dutch-backed troops in Srebrenica to be free to leave with their equipment on the 21st of July or shortly thereafter via Bratunac. Both the UN Profor commander and Mladic to observe the move. UN Profor to organise immediate evacuation of injured persons from Potocari and Bratunac, including provision of ambulances. UN Profor presence, quote, in one form or another, unquote, was agreed for, quote, key areas. Section 378. As concerns the other matters, it was agreed in principle that UNHCR and UN Profor forces would be given freedom of movement to and from Gorazde and Zepa via Belgrade and Visegrad. Normal traffic would be established to Sarajevo via the land corridor between Kiseljak, quote, Sierra 1, and Ilidza. The UN Profor commander maintained that he would continue to use the route over Mount Igman, whether he deemed that the circumstances on the route via Kiseljak were unsatisfactory. The Serbs proposed that all generals commanding warring parties be invited, in the presence of Mr. Blid, to discussions on the cessation of hostilities agreement. A meeting would be arranged for UNHCR with General Guerrero to be held at noon on the 16th of July at Johorina. Section 379. Shortly after the meeting, the Special Representative's staff in Zagreb informed him that the BSA had released the Dutch-backed soldiers being held hostage, and that they would be picked up the following day in Belgrade. The Special Representative staff also prepared an update on the situation as they knew it at that point. They wrote that 10,000 people were rumoured to be making their way through the forest, and that reportedly less than one-third of them were armed. And they went on to state, quote, we still have no clear idea where the Bosnian males in Srebrenica are. UNHCR has heard rumours that the men could now be in Bijazina. The United Nations military observers have heard shots in the forest near Bratunac, suggesting that some of the men could have been shot. MSF is reporting massacres on the road between Bratunac and Kladanj even, and this could explain the 4 buses which disappeared. The report confirmed that ICRC still had not obtained access to any of the missing men or boys. Section 380. Also by the 15th of July, UN Profor and UNHCR had stated to resolve their differences with the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina over the relocation of the displaced persons from Srebrenica. The Special Representative reported to United Nations headquarters in New York that there were 5,670 displaced being housed in roughly 720 tents at the Tuzla Air Base. The Bosnian government authorities had begun to arrange accommodation for another 11,000 displaced in various locations within the Tuzla canton. Scores of other displaced persons were able to find accommodation with friends and relatives of their own. By the 15th of July, ICRC had registered a total of 19,700 women, children, and elderly, and a very small number of men of military age, as having passed through Kladanj from Potocari. UNPF estimated that up to 20,000 persons from Srebrenica, mainly men of military age, remained unaccounted for. UNPF added as a note of caution, however, that the figure of those missing had been deduced from the enclave's total population, estimated by UNHCR at 42,000, which was assumed to be inflated, though it was not clear to what extent. UNPF indicated that the only reports received on the men's whereabouts to date was from MSF, which believed that some 700 males were being held in the football stadium at Bratunac. Section 381. Members of UN Profor's Civil Affairs staff, representatives of the United Nations High Commissioners for Human Rights and Refugees, ICRC, various non-governmental organizations and member states, as well as members of the press, began interviewing the displaced persons who had gathered at the Tuzla Air Base and the surrounding areas as they arrived. They began to tell the stories of the killings they had witnessed, and the abductions and rapes of which they are aware. None of the survivors of the mass executions had yet made it to Tuzla, however. Meanwhile, the United Nations military observers reported that the BSA had now taken over their former headquarters in the PTT building in Srebrenica. The first group of Serb families were also now moving into the houses left vacant by the town's former inhabitants. Section 382. Amidst the growing concerns about the fate of the men in Srebrenica, the ongoing attack on Žepa, and concerns of potential attacks on other safe areas, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, that being John Major, called for a major international conference to be held in London on the 21st of July in order to decide on a strategy to address this crisis. Section G. 16th to the 18th of July. Mladic still does not honour the agreements related to Srebrenica. Widespread reports of atrocities begin to surface. Section 383. The Dutch Bat soldiers who had previously been held hostage in areas held by the Bosnian Serbs arrived in Zagreb on the afternoon of the 16th of July and returned to the Netherlands the following day. The following remained in Potocari awaiting relocation: 383 Dutch Bat soldiers, 3 United Nations military observers, 6 UN Profor interpreters, 2 UNHCR local staff, 8 MSF staff, 2 representatives of the refugees, who had accompanied the Dutch Bat commander to negotiate with Mladic, the third who had been handed over to the BSA on the 13th of July and remained unaccounted for, and approximately 88 wounded local inhabitants. Section 384. On the 16th of July, a convoy from the Norwegian Logistics Battalion based in Tuzla attempted to cross through Serbian-held territory to Potocari in order to pick up the remaining wounded at the Dutch Bat compound. The convoy was forced to turn back after being fired upon by the BSA. The BSA also hijacked a Dutch Bat convoy between Bratunac and Zvornik, confiscating the vehicle, weapons and equipment of the crew. It was not until the 17th to the 18th of July that the ICRC was able to gain access to the wounded being held in Potocari and Bratunac. They were able to evacuate 65 of them to safety, but the BSA detained the remaining 23 as, quote, prisoners of war. ICRC was able to note their identity and whereabouts. At the same time, the BSA continued to deny access to the thousands of men whose whereabouts remained unaccounted for. It also pressured the deputy battalion commander of Dutch Bat and a representative of the Bosniak civilians in Srebrenica to co-sign a declaration indicating that the, quote, evacuation of the population of Srebrenica had been conducted according to international humanitarian law. The Dutch Bat officer concerned has since categorically rejected the validity of the, quote, declaration. He has stated that his signature and that of the Bosniak representative was solicited under duress, and that, in any event, it only applied to those convoys which United Nations personnel had escorted, as indicated in the handwritten notation which he insisted be inserted in the text. Section 385. Late in the evening of the 16th of July, and in the early morning hours of the 17th of July, some 4,500 to 6,000 from the column of the men and boys who had fled Srebrenica through the woods crossed into ARBIH-controlled territory in the southern Sapna area. Section 386. Interviewed in the context of this report, some of the Bosniaks who survived the 6-day march through the forest explained how, having crossed the first Serb cordon, they encountered a second cordon near the village of Križevići. Several hours of intense fighting had taken place, but they had managed to press on. Heavy rain and hail had provided some additional cover as the column passed through the municipality of Zvornik. As the column of Bosniak men approached the main Serb Federation confrontation line, they had attacked a Serb command post, capturing 2 tanks and a 20mm Praga gun. That is a anti-aircraft gun, I believe, probably more likely anti-helicopter. Using the captured tanks and guns, the Bosniaks then crossed the first of the 3 lines of the Serbian trenches. They then signalled forward to the Federation, hoping that the ARBIH Second Corps would launch a operation to hold down and divert Serb forces as they attempted to cross the confrontation line. The Second Corps did not mount any such diversionary attacks. However, Srebrenica's former commander, Nasser Oric, had assembled a company of volunteers on Federation territory. When Oric and his men ascertained the location at which the Srebrenica men would try to cross the Serb lines, they attacked the area, causing the Serbs to partially evacuate their forward trenches. This left only limited Serbian positions between the column of men and Oric's fighters. The men in the column were ordered to use all their remaining ammunition on this last line of Serb defence, including rounds which were being held in reserve for suicide in the event of capture. They broke through the Serb lines and reached ARBIH territory. Section 387. The following day, many of these men began arriving in the Tuzla area, searching for their families. The Bosnian government disarmed the survivors and transported them to collective shelters in the wider area of Tuzla. Members of UNPROFOR were able to interview a number of them and report their accounts to the mission's leadership. The men interviewed estimated that up to 3,000 of the 12,000 to 15,000 in the column had either been killed during combat with the BSA or when crossing over mines, while an undetermined number among them had also surrendered to the BSA. They did not know if the latter were still alive or where they were being held. A number had also committed suicide. These estimates suggested very roughly that between 4,000 and 7,500 of the men and boys in the column were still unaccounted for. Section 388. As of the 17th of July, the BSA continued to refuse to honour the agreements related to Srebrenica which Mladic had entered into in Belgrade 2 days earlier. The special representative of the Secretary General reported to New York that day that, quote, the status and location of unaccounted for persons and possible detainees, especially draft-age males, remains a large gap in our database. Unconfirmed reports provide accounts of detention centres, execution-style murder, rapes of young women, and other atrocities, as wider access to the area has not been granted by the BSA. It may be useful to continue, or even intensify, public and media attention on this issue. It is important not to allow momentum to dissipate on this issue, otherwise many thousands of lives may well be in danger, unquote. Section 389. The same day, one of the Dutch Bat soldiers, during his brief stay in Zagreb upon return from Serb-held territory, is quoted as telling a member of the press that, quote, hunting season is in full swing. It is not only men supposedly belonging to the Bosnian government who are targeted. Women, including pregnant ones. Children and old people aren't spared. Some are shot and wounded, others have had their ears cut off, and some women have been raped, unquote. The story was picked up by a number of wire services and reproduced. At approximately the same time, survivors of executions had also begun to recount their testimonies to the international and local press. 390. This prompted the Secretariat to write to the Special Representative the following day, quote, you will, no doubt, have read and heard the extensive reports of atrocities committed by the Bosnian Serbs during their recent takeover of Srebrenica. While many of these reports emerge from refugees, they are widespread and consistent, and have been given credence by a variety of international observers, including UNHCR. We have, however, received nothing on the subject from UN Profor, unquote. The Secretariat urged the Special Representative to ensure that UN Profor interview the Netherlands personnel who had already returned from Srebrenica. The instruction to the Special Representative continued, quote, "Our inability to corroborate, or authoritatively contradict, any of the allegations currently being made, many of which involve events which UN Profor in Potocari could not have been unaware, is causing mounting concern here," unquote. The Special Representative responded that the Dutch Bat soldiers that had been in Bratunac had been debriefed immediately upon arrival in Zagreb. He added, however, that such debriefings, quote, "did not reveal any first-hand accounts of human rights violations," unquote. Section H. 19th of July. Mladic and United Nations Protection Force Commander meet again and conclude agreement. Section 391. On the basis of his recent meeting with President Milosevic and General Mladic in Belgrade, the Special Representative of the Secretary-General was hopeful that both might feel it opportune to show some generosity. He sought the views of the UN Profor commander, who responded that, quote, "peacekeeping had come to an end," unquote, and that the safe area policy had, quote, "manifestly failed," unquote. In his view, the war would continue for some time, until there was symmetry in the territorial holdings of the belligerents. He thought that this symmetry might emerge as time was not on the side of the Bosnian Serbs, who he predicted would become relatively weaker as the months wore on. He warned that the Serbs would seek a ceasefire which would, quote, "seal their territorial gains," unquote. Section 392. The UN Profor commander met with Mladic on the 19th of July at the Restaurant Jela in Serb-held territory outside of Sarajevo. Throughout the meeting, he maintained contact with Mr. Blid, who was holding parallel negotiations with President Milosevic in Belgrade. The UN Profor commander again stressed to Mladic how essential it was that ICRC be granted immediate access to the men being detained, and that freedom of movement to the enclaves be restored for UN Profor and UNHCR. He pressed Mladic to explain his troops' troops' behaviour even, in the aftermath of the fall of Srebrenica, to which Mladic responded that his troops had, quote, "finished it in the correct way," unquote. Mladic added that, on the night of the 10th to the 11th of July, a significant number of ARBIH troops had broken through the confrontation line in the direction of Tuzla. Mladic continued that he had opened a corridor to let these troops go. He accepted that some, quote, "skirmishes had taken place with casualties on both sides, and that some, quote, "unfortunate small incidents," unquote, had occurred. The UN Profor commander and Mladic then signed the agreement, which provided for the following, quote, "ICRC access to all, quote, reception centres where the men and boys of Srebrenica were being held by the next day. UNHCR and humanitarian aid convoys to be given access to Srebrenica. The evacuation of wounded from Potocari, as well as the hospital in Bratunac. The return of Dutch Bat weapons and equipment taken by the BSA. The transfer of Dutch Bat out of the enclave commencing on the afternoon of the 21st of July, following the evacuation of the remaining women, children and elderly who wished to leave. Subsequent to the signing of this agreement, the Special Representative wrote to General Milosevic, reminding him of the agreement, that had not yet been honoured, to allow ICRC access to Srebrenica. The Special Representative later also telephoned President Milosevic to reiterate the same point. Section 393, the final section actually. During the meeting, Mladic claimed triumphantly that Zepa had fallen to advancing Serb forces. This, however, was untrue, and the situation on the ground in Zepa was complex. So there you have it. The aftermath of the fall of Srebrenica in two parts. I'm sure that there's a lot that you can learn from it that I haven't made clear. and I think it's certainly the sort of thing that deserves a lot of reflection. So I would encourage people to go into the comments and talk about their reflections on this particular genocide. I'd also like to ask people in the comments to not fight. I know you're going to do it anyway, but for every single one of these things that the Serbs perpetrated on the Bosnian Muslims, there was a similar degree in return. Nasser Oric, for example. So stay nice in the comments, or I will get involved in the comments. I'll see you guys.